I've always felt some sympathy for the Apostle Thomas, who, we are told, after the crucifixion of Jesus, doubted that the resurrection had occurred. He wanted proof. All that he got from Peter, James, Bartholomew, and the rest of the apostles was hearsay, improbable testimony. It always seemed reasonable to me, laudable even, that Thomas wanted something more. But of course, we can't always obtain the kind of proofs that we would like in life, and that's true both from a personal point of view and also for a court of law. It may sometimes be the case that a person may be guilty. We may know them to be guilty by any sensible measure of the word, but by the rules of the system to which we subscribe and submit in collective adjudication, this cannot be proved. Nowhere is this better demonstrated than in the case of the Risby murder of 1938, where the murderer was known to police, and yet there was no evidence that could possibly be placed before a court of law.
William Murfitt, who had been up since 5:30 that morning and busy about the farm, came in to breakfast at his usual hour of 8 a.m. on the 17th of May 1938. He sat down at the table in the dining room to read his newspaper, while the maid went to get his breakfast. His wife, Gertrude, rose from the table to get him his finnan salts, which he took each morning for his health. Everything was quite normal at Quays Farm, in the small village of Risby, Suffolk, with one exception. He had less than an hour left to live. Mrs. Murfitt took the lid off the finnan salts and noticed they looked brown, remarking to the farm secretary, Molly Targett, who was sitting at the dining table, "Do you think there's anything the matter with these salts? They look brown." She took a teaspoon and removed most of the brownish crystals from the top of the tin, and then made up a tumbler of the salts for her husband. William Murfitt drank off the glass of finnan salts and pulled a face. "Are you sure these are salts? They taste funny," he said. "Yes, of course," she replied. "Same as usual." She showed him the salts, and he said, "They're damp, you can see." A couple of minutes later, William began to feel unwell. He stood up and clutched the table and said, "I feel ill. Fetch a doctor." He then collapsed to the floor, where some cushions were placed under his head, while Molly Targett, his secretary, called for Dr. Hubert Ware. Meanwhile, Mrs. Murfitt instructed the maids to tidy the dining room. Murfitt was unconscious when the doctor arrived, but not for long. There had really been little need for urgency on the doctor's part. He said to Mrs. Murfitt, "I'm afraid your husband's dead." The doctor inquired about Mr. Murfitt's recent health, but Mrs. Murfitt said he had been well. He asked in particular what he had eaten for breakfast. Mrs. Murfitt said he had not had breakfast, and showed him the tin of finnan salts, which he said they both took each morning. The doctor inquired whether or not she had taken any that morning, and she said that she had not. She didn't fancy them, because when she opened the tin, they looked brown. The doctor sniffed the tin cautiously. The unmistakable aroma of bitter almonds came to him. The unique scent of potassium cyanide. The police were called, and a Sergeant Clifford Bigmore cycled over to the house. Mrs. Murfitt was very upset, at times hysterical, and said, "I wish I had taken a dose as well." Sergeant Bigmore took a look around, and inquired if anything in the dining room had been moved. Mrs. Murfitt told him she had tidied it up, in anticipation of the doctor's arrival. Having noted the circumstances, Bigmore arranged for the body of William Murfitt to be taken to West Suffolk General Hospital, and then took possession of a glass tumbler, a teaspoon with powder on it, and locked the door to the dining room. A post-mortem was held that afternoon by Dr. Ware at West Suffolk Hospital, and various organs were removed, and, along with the tin of finnan salts, these were sent to the leading authority on poisons, the Home Office analyst Dr. Roche Lynch at St. Mary's Hospital, Paddington, for examination. Although William Murfitt was overweight, suffered with diabetes and had an enlarged liver, indicating previous alcohol abuse, the post-mortem found he was in reasonable health. He was a non-smoker and non-drinker. It was apparent, even without Roche Lynch's confirmation, that William Murfitt had been poisoned, and furthermore, the suspicion was he had been murdered. William Murfitt was born in Wisbeach in Cambridge in 1882. His father was a farmer, and William helped him on the farm as a young man. But he had an adventurous side to him. He joined the army and fought in the Boer War in 1901 and was promoted to sergeant. He married Gertrude Eleanor Green in 1903, who bore him a son, Joseph Leslie, in 1904, and afterwards he travelled widely, working for a time in Australia. Another son, Billy, was born in 1912, and during the First World War, William Murfitt established a business in washing and supplying vegetables to the London market, aided, no doubt, by the shortages created by wartime conditions. He prospered, and by 1932 he was able to take the lease on the 1,000-acre Quays Farm in the Suffolk village of Risby, which he shrewdly planted with crops best suited to the varying soil types there. Hard-working and determined, by the late 1930s he had invested in the most modern farm machinery, and he employed 80 workers. He paid good wages, and he himself worked hard, rising at 5:30 each morning. He played hard too. He was forthright, ebullient, and sociable. A little too sociable, perhaps, with women, rather like a prize bull amongst his heifers. Although not quite the country gentleman, he rode to hounds, hunted, and shot almost anything which didn't keep still for long enough. He was not a cerebral man. His loves were farming, expensive cars, horse racing, and women, in no particular order. The Chief Constable of Suffolk realised immediately that this would require Scotland Yard's assistance, and 2 experienced detectives from the CID were sent to lead the investigation, Detective Chief Inspector Leonard Burt and Detective Sergeant Reginald Spooner. They at once set about taking statements and making inquiries into the matter. From their inquiries they learned that Mr. Murfitt had spent most of the previous day at another of his farms in Norfolk, returning home some time after 7 p.m. He then went out shooting until 8 p.m, when he returned and had supper with his wife. She retired at 9:30 p.m, and he a quarter of an hour later. Dr. Roche Lynch's tests confirmed that cyanide was indeed the poison which had killed William Murfitt, and from other tests he conducted, he discovered that when cyanide was added to Finnan salts, it turned them brown over the course of a few hours, until they became virtually black after 12 hours. As those who had seen the salts on the morning of the 17th of May described their appearance as light brown, Roche Lynch calculated that even if the degree to which air was excluded from the tin had inhibited the discoloration of the crystals, the cyanide must have been added no more than 12 hours prior to their being taken. This gave a 12-hour window in which someone had added the cyanide, between 8 p.m. and 8 a.m. on the 16th and 17th of May. It was also clear to Chief Inspector Burt that the person who had done this must have known of the salts and of the habit of their being taken by the Murfitts each morning. Furthermore, if Mrs. Murfitt was not the killer, then she must also have been an intended victim. Mrs. Murfitt told the detectives that only a few people knew of the habits of those in the house, including Mr. Murfitt, herself, the secretary, the maid, and the cook. There were also 4 friends and neighbours who might know of the salts, and who were familiar with the house, she said. Considering who might have a motive for wishing William Murfitt dead, the police discovered a gamekeeper who had quarrelled with William over gaming rights on the estate, and a shepherd whom Murfitt had recently dismissed. But both were quickly exonerated from any involvement in the murder. The couple's 2 sons, Leslie and Billy, were both absent from home. One lived in London, and the other was 4th engineer on a ship currently in the Mediterranean. Of course, the inhabitants of the house itself knew of the Murfitts' habits, the salts and so forth. But the maid who had been there 7 years, the cook who had been there 6 years, and the secretary for 9 years had no motive at all that could be discerned. Detectives made efforts to trace purchases of cyanide made in the area, and those in particular which had been made by any of the suspects. But this was no easy task, because it seemed at times as if everyone in Suffolk possessed cyanide as a means of destroying wasps' nests. In fact, in the 13 months prior to Murfitt's death, it was established that 425 purchases of cyanide had been made from 5 chemists' shops in Bury St Edmunds alone. This was sufficient to kill something like 45,000 people, twice the town's entire population. With regard to the death itself, detectives felt confident William Murfitt had not committed suicide. There was nothing in his life or in his behaviour the night before or on the morning of his death to indicate that this was anything other than a normal day. To introduce cyanide into a tin for his wife to give to him would seem incredible as a means of suicide. This left 5 possible suspects: Mrs. Murfitt and the 4 neighbours. These were a local farmer at Mosley's farm called Rippon Charles Browne, and Elaine Browne, his wife, and another farmer, James Walker, and his housekeeper, Mary Chandler. All were in a position to know of the habits of the Murfitts, of the finnan salts being kept on the sideboard in the dining room, and the means of access to the house. One of these 5 people had, in the view of Chief Inspector Burt, murdered William Murfitt. Prima facie, there was a strong case against Gertrude Murfitt. She had endured many years of neglect by her husband and his many affairs, including with a gamekeeper's daughter and his own niece. And of course she had ample opportunity for poisoning him. And yet, in spite of the apparent evidence for this, and after some initial suspicions, detectives Burt and Spooner doubted she was her husband's murderer. To begin with, she possessed a personal estate of £5,000 in her own right. Secondly, she had alluded to the strange colour of the salts quite openly to her husband, to the secretary, to the doctor and the police. She had not attempted to conceal this. She said she didn't fancy the salts herself because of their brown appearance, and she quite openly put them into the oven to dry them in the apparent belief that they were brown because they were damp. And third, in spite of the fact that Murfitt was serially unfaithful, she appeared to be genuinely devoted to him, tolerated his affairs, forgave easily, and held no grudges. It was entirely possible, though, the detectives thought, that one of the 4 friends and neighbours might have gained entry to the house by some means. Detectives noted there were 4 doors to Quays Farm, 3 rear doors whose keys were kept in the locks on the inside, 2 of which were usually kept locked during the day, and a front door which was fitted with a Yale lock and an unused deadlock. The rear doors were observable from William Murfitt's office, and also from other vantage points at the rear business end of the house. To the right of the front door, however, immediately inside the hallway, was the door to the dining room, and here was a sideboard on which the finnan salts were kept. The front door therefore seemed the most likely means of entry. This had 4 keys, one which Murfitt kept on a chain about him, one which Mrs. Murfitt kept in her handbag, one which their son, who was away at sea, kept in his bedroom, and a 4th key, which was missing. Of the 4 friends, each appeared to have a motive. Elaine Browne was a 41-year-old, tall, attractive woman, a modiste, who owned a fashionable boutique in Bury St Edmunds, and was a friend of Mrs. Murfitt. She dressed stylishly, and she had caught the eye of William Murfitt, not necessarily a difficult task. Although married to a Suffolk farmer herself, Rippon Charles Browne, who was 17 years her senior, she and William Murfitt had engaged upon an affair 2 years before the murder. Elaine Browne had become pregnant by him and had an abortion. Mrs. Murfitt became suspicious of the 2. She wrote in her diary, which she volunteered to police, that she had hired a private detective to follow her husband, and that he had obtained proof that the 2 were engaged upon an affair. But she told the detectives she had only done this so that her husband would read the diary and end the affair. At length she had confronted William, and he denied it. So did Elaine. Then Mrs. Murfitt made an alarming suggestion to them. She said she would divorce William so the two could be together. They were aghast at her suggestion. Elaine had no desire to break up her own home, nor William his. They confessed all, and agreed to end the affair. And Mrs. Murfitt rather sportingly forgave her husband, and remained good friends with Elaine. Elaine's husband, Rippon Charles Browne, clearly had a strong motive for murdering Murfitt, but he was apparently unaware of his wife's infidelity until the police investigation obliged Elaine to inform him of it. In due course he was interviewed by Chief Inspector Burt, who asked him if he had never suspected his wife and William Murfitt of having an affair. Many people in the small village of Risby appeared to know of it. Had he not known of it? He told Inspector Burt that he had heard rumours but did not believe them. Was it possible that Browne had known them and yet never challenged his wife over these stories? Did he know and choose not to confront the situation? Or did he know and choose to do something rather deadly about it? If he did, he was good at concealing his animosity towards William Murfitt, because he and Elaine spent most of the day with Murfitt and his wife on a motor yacht at Horning on the Norfolk Broads, just 2 days prior to the murder, and all had been well between them. In any case, Bert had difficulty in seeing Browne as being the kind of man who would sneak into the Murfitts' house at night and poison the salts as a way of exacting revenge. It seemed unlikely, and there was no evidence whatsoever of this, just a strong motive, which Browne claimed did not exist prior to Murfitt's death. It all seemed a little Sicilian rather than Suffolkonian. The remaining suspects, James Walker of Hall Farm, some 300 or 400 yards away, and his housekeeper Mary Chandler, quickly came sharply into focus during the investigation. James Walker had moved to Hall Farm in 1926, and no sooner had he done so than his wife Minnie died. Somewhat lonely following her death, a short time afterwards, Mary Chandler arrived to keep house for him. Soon Walker was taking his housekeeper to social events, to neighbours' houses for dinner. Naturally, this raised eyebrows in a small village like Risby. It was certainly an unusual thing for a well-to-do widower to consort so openly with his housekeeper. Rumours abounded. It was said that the housekeeper did not rise before lunchtime each day, that she dressed rather fancily for a housekeeper and had too much money, and that Mr. Walker seemed far too happy for a recent widower. When police went to interview Mr. Walker following the death of William Murfitt, he said he would rather a solicitor was present for the interview. That struck police as being strange. However, he did make a statement to say he had known his housekeeper since before his wife died in 1926. He also said he was born in Calcutta and was aged 60. In Leonard Bert's view, he was an educated and intelligent man. Police were interested to discover that William Murfitt had earlier that year banished Mary Chandler from his house because he discovered her cheating at cards. He also told his wife to have nothing further to do with her. But what drew their greatest interest to the occupants of Hall Farm was the matter of the fur coat. It seems that 41-year-old Mary Chandler had asked William Murfitt could she go to the Newmarket races with him in September 1937, and he had agreed. Apparently she won a great deal of money there, because a few days after her return she showed Gertrude Murfitt an expensive mink coat, which she said she was selling for a friend in Scotland. Mrs. Murfitt suggested she sell it to her furrier in London's Regent Street. A couple of days afterwards Mary Chandler told her that she had bought the coat herself, but that she wished to sell it still. It was, of course, something of a surprise to find that a housekeeper could afford to buy such an expensive coat on a housekeeper's salary. In any case, Mary Chandler went with Mrs. Murfitt to Regent Street and sold the coat, receiving £120 for it. That's £8,000 in 2020 terms. Meanwhile, a few miles away in Newmarket, Mrs. Edith Waugh, a haughty lady whose husband trained horses, and at whose house James Walker and Mary Chandler had been visitors on a number of occasions, found she was missing a mink coat. She was greatly upset at this, because she had bought the coat herself, and it was her pride and joy. She called the police and demanded imperiously that they find her coat for her. They did. It was in an exclusive furrier's shop in Regent Street in London. It had been sold to the shop by Mrs. Mary Chandler. Police questioned Mary Chandler, who now said that she had bought the mink coat of a lady she met at Newmarket whilst there with William Murfitt. She had no receipt for the coat, and said it had been paid for out of her winnings on that day. She had brought the coat back to Murfitt's car in his absence, and placed it on the back seat. The police interviewed Murfitt, and he said Mrs. Chandler had had no coat with her, and when they drove back from Newmarket, she had not mentioned this in the car to him. He also said she could not have placed it on the back seat before his return to the car, because it had been locked. He had, he said, dropped Mrs. Chandler with his chauffeur in his other car en route, and she had not had a second fur coat with her when she changed cars. The chauffeur also gave police a statement that Mrs. Chandler had not had a coat with her when she got into the car from Murfitt's Buick. In fact, all she had in her hand was a racing card, he said. Interestingly, a front door key to Mrs. Edith Warre's house was also missing after a visit by Mary Chandler and James Walker, and police believed she had used this to gain entry to steal the fur coat. Mrs. Chandler was charged with the theft of the fur coat, and William Murfitt and his wife informed James Walker that they intended to tell the truth to the police. Mrs. Chandler fled to Scotland. She was in a bad position, because it seemed she had been bound over for the theft of a fur coat once before, and that meant an inevitable prison sentence if convicted of this further offence. Could this have been a motive for murder, to prevent the Murfitts from giving evidence which looked set to send her to prison? James said he would stand by his housekeeper, and dismissed the Murfitts' evidence to police. Mary Chandler was interviewed by detectives, and gave the same account as James Walker. Both said they did not know about the Finnan salts. They also hinted that they knew a great secret about Murfitt, and when separately encouraged by officers to divulge this, intimated that Murfitt had committed suicide. Further inquiries into her background revealed Mrs. Chandler to be a fanciful woman. She told numerous people that her husband had been a doctor who had died on the polo field. Her father was a barrister, and her grandfather was the Earl Marshal of Scotland. She herself had been presented at court and owned property in India. But none of this was true. Mary Chandler was, in fact, born Mary Fernie Elizabeth Higgins in 1897 in Pitlessie in Fife, Scotland, the daughter of a coal miner. When she left school at 14, she worked for a time in a colliery herself. But she soon went into domestic service, first with one family, then with another, then just a few months later for another family in Douglas Street, Kirkcaldy. She was dismissed from this employment when they caught her stealing from them. But 2 years later, Mary used credit on their account to defraud them. They were about to prosecute her when she was taken on as a nurse to someone called Lord Beckenham. They demurred at this apparent change in her fortunes, and the police dropped charges. Mary then travelled to India with Lord Beckenham. He may have been a figment of her imagination, as there seems to be no trace of him. And here she married the managing director of Messrs. J.H. Chandler and Co. Limited, chemists of Naini Tal. He was an older man who had a daughter, and for whatever reason, the marriage quickly foundered, and Mary left India for England, arriving in April 1924. From here she went to live at Kingston-on-Thames. She received sums of money from her husband at intervals, often inventing pretexts for these, which in due course he discovered to be false. It was then, in October of 1924, that she was charged over the theft of a fur musquash coat, valued at £96. That's approximately £6,000 today, for which she was fined £50, approximately £3,000, and bound over for 2 years. It was not known where she was between 1924 and 1926, But according to Mr. Walker, in December 1926, 6 months after his wife's death, she went to Hall Farm as his housekeeper. The maid at Hall Farm said that Mrs. Chandler had written to her from Scotland in the previous summer and asked her to send a bottle from the left-hand corner of a bench in the cloakroom to her. When the maid went to look, she found a bottle marked poison, potassium cyanide there. It was the only bottle in the cloakroom. She decided it could not possibly be this she wanted, and wrote back to the housekeeper saying she could not find it. Mrs. Chandler sent a postcard saying she would ask Mr. Walker to find it for her. A farm worker at Hall Farm said that on 2 occasions in the past 2 years he had destroyed wasps' nests with Mr. Walker, using the same bottle described by the maid. Both Walker and Mrs. Chandler denied its existence. Mrs. Chandler said the bottle she had requested the maid to send her was a lotion, and then, after consulting with a solicitor in private, said it was boracic crystals, which have the advantage of resembling potassium cyanide. But as these cost 3 pence per 4 ounces, the police thought it highly unlikely that she would send for this by post when it was such a commonly available commodity. The police asked James Walker again about the cyanide in front of the worker who had told them about destroying wasps' nests with his employer. Now Walker recalled having purchased cyanide once in 1934, twice in 1936, and once in 1937. He had not, he said, as far as he could recall, sent his housekeeper any cyanide in Scotland. Police also learned that Mary Chandler had taken a cake to Quays Farm the day after Murfitt's death. They asked her why she had done this, and she said she had made it from ingredients given her by Mrs. Murfitt, and had meant to take it over on the 16th of May, but forgot. But the maid at Hall Farm said she had made 2 cakes, neither of which were from Mrs. Murfitt's ingredients. Questioning both Walker and his housekeeper convinced police they were both compulsive liars. They changed their stories at will. Walker often said one thing and then claimed another. Then he would alter his story again or claim not to remember. Chief Inspector Bird's view of Mrs. Chandler was that she was a woman of great cunning. In fact, the more he looked at Mary Chandler, the less he liked her. Detectives were informed of a local scandal involving a betting scam. Mary Chandler had apparently placed bets on a number of horses in the same race, in the names of a number of women in the district, including that of Elaine Browne, collecting only on the winning ticket, and leaving the payment of the losing tickets to the women. When these women received bills for the failed bets, they knew nothing of them, and refused to pay the bookmaker. He became wary of taking any further bets by phone, and when a woman with a Scottish accent rang to place a bet, he refused it. But minutes later, a woman entered the betting shop and tried to place a bet. He recognized her voice and accused Mary Chandler of fraud. She denied it. He was prepared to go to the police, but James Walker begged him not to, and promised to pay him £40. The betting manager received only £15 of this. It seems there was another unusual and suggestive peccadillo Mary Chandler had. She seemed to have a habit of being discovered in places where she shouldn't have been. Gertrude Murfitt told police that on one occasion she had discovered Mary Chandler in her bedroom, and when found, Mary had simply said, "Sorry, I rang the bell and couldn't make the maids hear. I've got a car outside and wondered if you would like to come uptown with me." Gertrude said that this could not have been true because the doorbell battery had recently been changed. On another occasion, Mrs. Chandler had been at Quays Farm for supper. She excused herself at some point and was gone for a long time, so Mrs. Murfitt went to find her. She found Mary Chandler in her bedroom, standing beside a wardrobe. Mrs. Chandler said she had rung a maid for assistance, but the maid had not heard the bell. Mrs. Murfitt did not, of course, believe her. Her sister, Mrs. Kate Ruston, entertained James Walker and Mary Chandler. Mrs. Chandler excused herself at some point, and was subsequently found by Mrs. Ruston in an upstairs bedroom. Mrs. Chandler said she was looking for a needle and thread to mend a ladder in her stocking. Afterwards, a nightdress was found to be missing. Another time, Mrs. Ruston discovered £5 was missing from her handbag after Mrs. Chandler had been alone with it in the dining room. Numerous other thefts were associated with Mary Chandler too, including an ermine coat from the Farmers' Benevolent Ball in February 1937, which a maid at Hall Farm said she had subsequently seen in Mrs. Chandler's wardrobe. Mrs. Elaine Browne had lost an evening dress, Mrs. Murfitt a gold lighter, and subsequently saw Mary Chandler with an identical one, and a local golf club suspected her of several thefts. There seemed to be no end to Mary Chandler's larcenous enterprise. But there was an even more suggestive incident, that of the fire at Hall Farm. Every year, James Walker's wealthy mother came to stay with her son for 3 months. Mary Chandler did not get on with her, and there was clearly a mutual dislike between the two women. Mary left on the occasion of one of these visits, refusing to be in the same house as her employer's mother. Mrs. Walker was in the habit of buying her son a new car every couple of years or so. On one such occasion, Mary had refused to accompany mother and son when they went to buy a car. James Walker returned from this shopping trip with a brand new Triumph sports car. Mary Chandler told a neighbouring couple she hated the car, that she loathed everything about it. They then reported to James Walker and his mother that they had seen the housekeeper slashing the tyres with a pair of scissors. The next day the car had mechanical problems and had, according to the garage, been tampered with. The nuts on the wheels were also found to have been loosened. After this, the car was left in the garage at Hall Farm. Then one evening the fire brigade was called to Hall Farm. It seems the garage had caught fire and destroyed both the garage and the new Triumph car it housed. On being told of the fault with the car on a previous occasion, the fire brigade decided that it had been caused by faulty wiring in the car. The insurance company paid out £200 to James Walker for his loss, but insurance officials told police there was disquiet over this. Concerning the murder at Quays Farm, detectives Burt and Spooner learned that Mary Chandler was seen by 2 witnesses, the chauffeur and a maid, outside the farm 4 days before the murder on the evening of the 12th of May. Of course, when asked about this, she denied it. The inquest into the death of William Murfitt under the Bury St Edmunds coroner Thomas Wilson was opened and adjourned the day after Murfitt's death, and his funeral took place on the 20th of May, from which Mrs. Murfitt had to be led away before its conclusion because she was said to be prostrate with grief. The inquest was tricky for Thomas Wilson, the coroner, because the trial of Mary Chandler concerning the theft of the fur coat was impending. The outcome of this case would clearly impact on any case against Chandler in respect of the murder of William Murfitt, because it would furnish motive. If she was acquitted, then a mainstay of the prosecution case against Mary Chandler for the murder would disappear. The inquest was thus delayed to allow the fur coat case to run to completion. In this regard, Mary Chandler appeared before the justices at Newmarket Petty Sessions on the 16th of June 1938. There were 2 charges against her. The first was of theft of the fur coat from the home of Mrs. Edith Waugh. The second was of receiving stolen goods. There was sufficient evidence for the theft of the mink coat. Mary Chandler had, quite surely, stolen it, and her story of buying it from an unknown lady at Newmarket races was clearly a fabrication, rebutted by Murfitt's evidence that he had locked the car at Newmarket, so she could not have put the coat in there as she claimed, and by the fact she had neither spoken of it to him on the return journey nor removed it from the car when she changed cars. But with Murfitt's death his evidence could not now be heard. The larceny charge was dismissed, but Mary Chandler was committed for trial for receiving stolen goods. The receiving charge still stood, and although weakened by the absence of Murfitt's evidence, the prosecution looked likely to succeed because it could be proved that she was in possession of a stolen coat, and could offer no reasonable account of how this was so. But it wasn't enough. Mary Chandler was acquitted on this charge also. Police were surprised, especially as both James Walker and his housekeeper had done rather badly under cross-examination. It was a blow not just to the detectives who had brought the case of the theft against Mary Chandler, but to Burt and Spooner. A major plank of their case against Mary Chandler, by which they were hoping to establish motive at the inquest, was swept aside. Police noted that had Mrs. Murfitt also died, no prosecution would have been attempted in respect of the fur coat at all. As it was, the absence of Murfitt's testimony had caused the prosecution to fail. The inquest into Murfitt's death resumed on the 24th of June. A carefully briefed coroner did his best to place the facts of the murder and the suspected role of Mary Chandler in this under maximum scrutiny. "Were you in Mrs. Murfitt's house between 8 o'clock in the morning and 9 o'clock on the Tuesday morning, the 17th of May, 1938, when Mr. Murfitt died?" he asked. "Never," she replied. "Was the Hall Farm farmer, so far as you know?" "No." "Can you say he could not have been there without your knowledge?" "He could have been there." "Could you have been there without his knowledge?" "No, because I was in bed." "I don't understand. Why does the fact you were in bed make it impossible for you to be out without the farmer's knowledge?" "He knew I was in bed when he went out, and I was still in bed at lunchtime." "Well, could you have got up and gone out, or he got up and gone out, without each other's knowledge?" asked the coroner. "No." "Why not?" "Because we were in each other's rooms." "We were in each other's rooms?" inquired the coroner. "I mean he was in my room." Eventually the coroner said, "So it really comes to this. Neither the farmer can say what you were doing on Monday morning, nor can you say what the farmer was doing. Is that right?" "Yes." "And the same applies to the afternoon?" "Yes." And concerning the night, the coroner inquired, "Were you sleeping in the same bed?" "Yes," replied Mary Chandler. Mary Chandler was keen to establish an alibi for the night, not the previous morning or afternoon. The police believed this was because she knew that that was when the poison had been introduced to the salts. The inquest was adjourned until the 21st of July 1938 to give police more time to carry out inquiries. Under apparent great mental strain, James Walker went to see Chief Inspector Leonard Burt on the 7th of July. He had split up with Mary Chandler, he told them. He had been a fool and wanted to be open and frank. But he told detectives nothing further, and remained obscure concerning the cyanide and other matters pertaining to the murder. He was careful to tell them that he had asked the housekeeper to leave the house, was concerned also that she might take her own life. He seemed to be hedging his bets. Mary Chandler saw her solicitor and then went into a nursing home in Cambridge that same day. The police went to see Walker 5 days later, on the 12th of July, hoping that now Chandler had gone, he might be more forthcoming. He said he was a fool and had been blind, but he gave no further useful intelligence on anything at all. Police began to treat him rather cautiously. They knew him to be a very intelligent man, and an unmitigated liar. The police thought it incredible that a man of the farmer's intelligence could be deceived by the woman. They simply did not believe him. On the 21st of July, the inquest resumed. The coroner noted Walker and Mary Chandler had been unreliable witnesses, and also noted Chandler's acquittal over the fur coat. The jury was absent for 30 minutes, before giving its verdict of murder by a person or persons unknown. Mary Chandler was not named. It was a victory of sorts for her. Burt did everything he could to find new evidence. He even walked from Hall Farm to Quays Farm at night to see if it could be done without being seen. He recorded that it had taken him 10 minutes round trip, and that he was seen by no one. He re-interviewed Walker, but he said nothing which incriminated Mary Chandler. Throughout, his main interest seemed to be in ensuring that he did not himself go to prison by proving an accessory after the fact. For Chief Inspector Burt, there was nowhere left to go. The investigation had failed, and he and Sergeant Spooner returned to London. The case failed for 3 reasons. Firstly, the lack of evidence. There was nothing to prove that Mary Chandler had been at Quays Farm between 8 p.m. and 8 a.m. on the 16th and 17th of May, the crucial window of opportunity at which the killer must have entered the house and added cyanide to the salts. There was a great deal of anecdotal evidence to support the theory, but without a single proof of her being there, it amounted to nothing more than a reasonable suspicion. Secondly, there were a number of other people who had motive sufficient to murder William Murfitt. Mrs. Murfitt resented her husband's affairs, and therefore might wish to exact her revenge on him. In addition, she had given him the cyanide in the salts, abstaining from taking any herself. Mr. Browne surely must have known of his wife's affair with Murfitt. If the whole village knew, and he admitted to having heard such rumours, had he really not taken steps to verify them? If he did know, his own motive was a powerful one indeed. He knew the habits of the Murfitts, could easily have taken steps to procure the missing key. Elaine Browne, too, jilted by Murfitt, jealous of his other affairs, may have wished to prevent her husband from finding out about Murfitt. The fact that he learned of this as a consequence of Murfitt's death could have been an unforeseen consequence. And there were surely other men whose wives had succumbed to Murfitt's ebullient charm. Too many suspects had the effect of removing the focus from the most probable one. Even if a prosecution had been brought, a jury would very quickly have been distracted by such possibilities by an adept lawyer. Thirdly, the reason for the failure of the case was the support given by Walker to the chief suspect, Mary Chandler. Much of the anecdotal evidence gathered could have been supported by him had he so wished. He tacked in the course of his evidence outrageously, and yet its effect was to undermine the case against Mary Chandler. It was surely Mary Chandler who killed William Murfitt. She was a cunning and spiteful woman. She was slighted by the cheating accusation, and she was a woman who would slash the tyres of her lover and sabotage his car, rendering it dangerous to drive without compunction, and ultimately was prepared to burn the garage to the ground to remove the object of her annoyance. Although the motive for Mary Chandler to commit murder was lightweight, for her it was sufficient. She feared the testimony of the Murfitts concerning the fur coat, which would probably have sent her to jail, and moreover she resented their willingness to give such testimony against her, additional to their previous offence of accusing her of cheating and ostracizing her. She was an ingenious woman, endlessly inventive and drawn to criminality in all its manifestations, often merely for the sake of it. And more than this, she had astonishing nerve. She had what Burt characterized as effrontery. When police spoke to Mary Chandler's mother in Scotland during the course of their investigations, she told them that Mary had fallen on her head as a child and was not right again afterwards. Perhaps that may provide an explanation. James Walker was a weak man, enthralled to her and surely an accessory after the fact. He found Mary Chandler exciting. He thrilled to her ingenuity, her lack of fear, and the complete absence of anything immoral in her make-up. He lacked her nerve, her criminal resolution, and he had the natural fear all normal people have when confronted by the police. He was stressed to the point of collapse when interviewed, on one occasion prostrate, according to Burt, eyes closed, under great mental strain. The two were soulmates of a kind. Perhaps they fell out because James Walker could not stand the stress he was under as a result of the inquiry. He did what he could to extricate himself from police pressure, distancing himself from Mary Chandler, but he could not bring himself to go further. He did not incriminate her, and it may be that the split between them was in any case contrived. They were such a devious pair that nothing can be ruled out in their case. Mary Chandler had had enough of the Murfitts by May 1938, and she decided to remove them, just as she had done with the Triumph sports car. She had the missing key, just as she had almost certainly stolen the key of Mrs. Warre's house for the purpose of stealing her fur coat. She probably stole the Murfitts' key at an earlier opportunistic date, simply with the intention of perpetrating a robbery in the future. It is simply a likelihood based on her previous form and on the congruity of events which suggest this. She walked under cover of the darkness that evening to Hall's Farm. Darkness because she was seen by two people when it was dark 4 days earlier. On that occasion it may have been, as Bert suspected, a reconnaissance mission. Or it could have been that she intended to poison Murfitt and his wife on that occasion, but was thwarted by being seen. And darkness because she would prefer the twilight, as there would be some visibility to make her way down the unlit lane or across the adjacent field. The morning light would not be her friend for the journey, because farmers rise early. She did it with her customary nerve, that effrontery which had served her so well over the years, and which had brought her to the verge of ruin, had now brought her to murder. This enterprise was one requiring the greatest nerve of all. She had an excuse at the ready. She always did, when she was caught somewhere she shouldn't be, caught almost in the very act of theft. She explained it with the most trifling, the most improbable of excuses. It didn't matter that she was not believed, only that she had an explanation which could not be disproved. Perhaps she had a cake with her, or something she wanted to drop off with her neighbour. Perhaps it was a makepeace on account of the soured relations of late. Whatever it was, she was prepared. Mary had in her possession the bottle of cyanide. There was a Surfeit of Cyanide in Suffolk in 1938. Her purpose was clear. She was going to kill the Murfitts, and she would do it by the same means by which she undertook all her dishonest undertakings, by stealth and by casual effrontery. She walked the 300 or 400 yards to Quays Farm on the evening of the 16th of May 1938. The sun set at 8:46 p.m. After 9 p.m. Risby was dark and deserted. Had she been observed, it would have been necessary to abort the enterprise a second time. But this time she arrived at the front door unseen, and she unlocked the door and entered. It would seem to a normal person to be dangerous and incriminating to be caught inside a locked house, and in the evening at twilight, after being banished from the house. It was reckless, of course, but that was the secret of her success. Like a magician, only hesitation and guilt would betray her, and she did not possess these adversaries to action and enterprise. Mary Chandler would have been ready with an unfaltering explanation. The key was in the door. She had thought it odd and came in to check. She found it lying in the road outside, perhaps, and she thought not to disturb anyone. "Here is a lovely cake I made for you." Only Mary Chandler knew what was in her mind. If Mrs. Murfitt or anyone else were uncomfortable, disconcerted by her discovery, what did their suspicion amount to? Could they call the police and tell them that their neighbour had entered the property and left a cake with them? The sheer nerve of Mary Chandler outwitted normal people because it defied normal behaviour. In any case, Mary Chandler was not seen entering the house, and she turned right into the dining room and without any difficulty located the salts on the sideboard, where the tin was always kept, and she poured in the grains of cyanide and left the house by the same means. She returned to Hall Farm. What did Walker know of this? He knew of it. Mrs. Chandler revelled in all things illicit. She was a most thrilling companion for Mr. Walker. She dared what he would not, to do the things with equanimity that caused him to falter. Walker knew that she had murdered Murfitt. If he had not known of it beforehand, then he certainly did after its commission. He was an accessory after the fact, but quite probably before it also. He was with her during countless thefts, when fur coats, ermine no less, materialized magically in her possession, gold lighters, money, jewels. She requested a bottle of cyanide of him. He knew better than anyone her inexplicable but timely absences during dinner at someone's house. He knew she had slashed the tires of the car he drove his mother in, knew she had interfered with the mechanics, and of course knew she had burnt the garage to the ground and the car within it. He had no qualms about claiming the insurance on this and other property. He knew she had stolen Mrs. War's fur coat, and he knew a great deal more than the police and others ever discovered. And before William Murfitt's murder, when being questioned about the fur coat, he said to detectives, "Mark my words, both of you, before this case is over there will be another strange coincidence, and there won't be any collusion." He had known there would be a murder. Mary Chandler was already aggrieved over the cheating accusation and her banishment from the Murfitts, from all other society in the area as a result, from the rumours now spreading openly about her. She was a spiteful and vindictive woman. There would be a reckoning. He knew this because he knew Mary Chandler as no one else did, and he had something dark in his own personality, a deep dishonesty at least, and probably much more. "Remember," he said to a startled Mrs. Murfitt, tapping her on the shoulder significantly the day of her husband's death, "we never let our friends down." As for Mary, she had no such difficulty with detectives. She lied with confidence and ease. The practised liar does not blink to an honest man. At the inquest, her solicitor asked the coroner if Mary Chandler might be excused due to her incapacitation in a nursing home. The coroner remarked acidly that she had been known to have left the hospital in the past few days, and so she could remain for the inquest, in the event she was not called. The police pinned their hopes on Walker. They thought he might have feared being himself exposed by his involvement in her other depredations. It was a reasonable supposition that he had been involved in Mary's thefts in some capacity. He was not merely her defender, he was her confederate. Of course, none of this could ever be used in evidence against Mary Chandler. It was merely anecdotal evidence which the police could use privately to obtain a full picture of their suspect. And therein lay a problem for the police. Mary Chandler had motive. She fitted the bill perfectly from several points of view. But there was no proof at all, and certainly nothing which could be brought before a court of law in a murder case. She may have had a grudge against the Murfitts. She may have obtained a key. She may have obtained cyanide from Hall Farm. She may have known of the Murfitts' habits of taking Finnan salts each morning, and she may have entered the house on the 16th of May and added cyanide to the salts. But there was no proof whatsoever that this is what occurred, and the proof required by a court of law is not of reasonable suspicion, but of conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. That standard of proof was not met. All that was required was that Mary Chandler was seen by someone entering Quays Farm, but she was not. There is a final possibility which might explain the curious relationship existing between Walker and Chandler. This concerns the matter of his wife Minnie Walker's death in June of 1926. Mary Chandler's arrival as a housekeeper occurred 6 months after this. The police looked at this because Walker's first wife's family had grave suspicions concerning her death. She died of cerebral hemorrhage and Raynaud's disease. The symptoms were vague and ambiguous. The local doctor wrote out a death certificate and gave Minnie's cause of death on the descriptions given of symptoms by her husband. Minnie was 47 years old at the time and in good health. There was no post-mortem and no inquest. The way in which the death had been dealt with was clearly unsatisfactory. But it was now 12 years on. There was no prospect of finding poison in a body in 1938 after such a lapse of time, and the doctor concerned was now dead. Police could find no evidence of Mary Chandler's whereabouts during 1926, but nor could they find any evidence that she had been at the farm prior to December 1926. The only reason for demurring was that Walker, in his various accounts of his relationship with Mrs. Chandler, had said he had known Mary Chandler 20 years, 15 years, and 10 years respectively before settling on the convenient date of December 1926. There was nothing to contradict this. In spite of the family's misgivings concerning Minnie's death, there was nothing that could be done about it. It gives rise to a surmise, and if it is a wild one, then that is because the circumstances invite it, that Mary Chandler, or James Walker, or both, killed Minnie Walker in June 1926. The vague symptoms, the untimeliness, the after-events and the character of those involved suggest it merely. There is little else to recommend it without further proofs. Its advantage to me is that it offers a psychological affirmative of the candid and amoral relationship that subsisted in this pair, a relationship founded on a kind of antisocial glee, a united front against society, founded in its breach of taboos. When the inquest returned a verdict of murder against an unknown person, it was as good as an acquittal for Mary Chandler. The police still had murder on its hands, albeit one which they had already investigated to exhaustion. Without fresh evidence, the suspicion of police and the public would remain fixed on Mary Chandler. But beyond that, there really was nothing further that could be done. War was coming. Resources were required elsewhere. The police force would be pared to the bone by the need for manpower resources to counter the subversions that become a society's priority during time of war. Mrs. Gertrude Murfitt, distraught initially at her husband's death, seemed quickly to arrive at a point of apathy. Perhaps it was depression. In truth, he was no saint. Murfitt left his wife £23,000 in his will. That's about £1.5 million. A sale of the farm livestock and machinery realised £1,600 on the 10th of June. Mrs. Murfitt was a well-off woman, but she lived modestly thereafter. She went to live with her sister, Kate Ruston, at 10 North Brink, Wisbeach, for a while, and then lived at 13 All Saints Road, Ipswich. And it was here she lived until 1973, when she died. Mrs. Elaine Browne, Murfitt's paramour, whose affair caused her husband and Mrs. Murfitt such distress in 1938, and brought titillation and disapprobation in equal measure to the residents of Risby, never really recovered from the scandal, and died in 1947 at the age of 51. James Walker was himself finished in Risby. He sold up and left Hall Farm. But within a few months he had reunited quietly with Mary Chandler, and the two set up home together in Hawley in Surrey as Mr. and Mrs. Lang Walker. They ran the Cambridge Hotel in Gatwick for a time, and then retired to this house in the 1960s at St. Leonard-on-Sea near Hastings. James Walker died in 1971, and Mary Chandler, now Fernie Lang Walker, continued in the house, still fond of baking cakes, unknown in her community, except as being a rather eccentric elderly woman and a teller of fantastic tales involving herself and her elevated status. She died here on August the 19th, 1994, at the age of 97, leaving £660,000 to her niece, and was cremated at Hastings Cemetery a few days later, on the 2nd of September.